What is up, Dr. Jones?
Yo.
I think you should just pick that up so you don't have to lean over like that when you talk into it.
I like it.
Oh, you want to hold the
burp and you don't hear it.
Oh, praise God. All right. So this is the Homebrewed Christianity podcast. And the greatest thing about Homebrewed Christianity podcast is that I get to hang out with cool people like you. And this is like episode 978 of the Homebrewed Christianity podcast.
What year did you start the
2008.
Podcast? That's old. That's before the internet.
I know. Al Gore had barely thought of tubes at that point. And he was like, well, you got these tubes, and I want to save the planet, and I like podcasts. And one of the coolest parts of having a religious podcast where you like Jesus and don't hate the planet is there's a very small group of people you have to compete against.
Making you the number one podcast in that demographic.
In sheer longevity. So, like, when people start listening to Luke's... Newsworthy.
Newsworthy with Newsworthy.
But that's like the least newsworthy name of all time. I really feel like he has no friend in social media marketing when you come up with that name. But it's okay. His smile is worth $1 million. Anyway, one of the convenient things about having like episodes going back from 2008 is even if they are 90-minute dialogues with academics, just the sheer volume. When one nerd finds you, they download 500 episodes so you can taunt people like him and be like, yeah, well, that so good last year. I had like, I don't know, 1.75 million downloads or something like that. You can do it. But it's really just because you have a collection of nerds. The coolest part about the internet is being able to find small niche markets.
So with that in mind, we should probably welcome up here.
I was trying to just not even have him.
The new kid on the block.
Yeah. All right, Luke. So don't just boo Luke. What's his name? I forget. His
Newsworthy. Newsworthy.
Yeah, it's really hard to remember. Really hard.
It's
Luke, just come over here.
Come on, Luke. Luke Newsworthy.
Yeah, thank you for that.
It's a podcast, so you should use a microphone. You learned that at year 2. It's all good.
Check 1, 2.
No, yours isn't even on. So that was perfectly set up by Tripp.
And or my sound guy. But
Here's the thing. I had this idea.
You had an idea?
I had an idea.
Is
that
it
there are
about
like
God killing Jesus?
2,000 people come to Pepperdine this week to talk about Jesus, God, the Bible, and things like that. And I thought, well, we've got a book I'm super excited about that's going to come out that very same week. Why not piggyback on the Pepperdine Bible lectures and put together my 2 favorite podcasts and have a battle of the podcasts live at Malibu overlooking the ocean? I mean, why wouldn't you do that?
I don't know why you wouldn't.
Yeah. So I'm really here as the token Christian, right? Like the chances of you two going to heaven increase dramatically just because you might touch my leg on the way up to heaven.
There's a button.
Oh, did I turn off the button? Just.
And that's God.
Yeah.
God just muted Tony.
No, it's seriously great, though. I really appreciate the honor.
There's a ghost in the machine silencing the reprobate. Just
There's
cut
the
them
devil.
off.
Did God kill your microphone?
Is there a mimetic interpretation of it? Because is this
Have you guys
really
ever done a
working?
podcast before? Because none of these mics work.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your podcast?
What?
How long have you been doing it?
I have less than Tripp with total number of podcasts out there. Maybe 160 or something like that.
But dude, here's what's incredible. It's like you're kind of an up-and-comer on the scene. You're new on the scene. You're getting killer guests. Like
in the smile. Show everybody. Look at them.
You
Look at the
get
camera.
amazing
Get
guests
the
right
smile.
off the bat. You got amazing. It took him, I don't know, years and years to get Rob Bell. You in episode 3 get Rob Bell.
Sure.
How'd you do that? How'd you pull that off?
He
The smile,
smiled.
It's
the
a
hair.
smile. It really was that. They said, we want to do a podcast, but there are no Christian podcasts out there. And so I said, well, here's the weird thing. It's like, I actually go to church, and I'm a Christian. And Rob said, that's just like me.
Used to be.
I was about to
Like
say,
I used to be.
Tony and I go to church more than Rob Bell.
Okay.
Combined. Maybe combined.
No, like, I've missed like 8 weeks of church service I wasn't hurling in my whole life.
Can I tell you, the last time I interviewed Rob, he accused me of answering a question with a vague answer.
Yeah.
What?
That's like accusing the Pope of answering a question with Latin.
It takes, talent respects talent.
So you're a pastor. Tripp's a fired pastor, former pastor.
Yes, I'm about to be one too.
You're actually a pastor.
Yes, I'm a pastor of a church.
Until this episode.
Yeah,
hits
probably
the
for
airwaves.
about 2 weeks or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many people in your church? Okay, you are pastor of a Church of Christ congregation.
Yes, I am. True church.
At the True Church. Do you guys use instruments?
Until last Sunday, the answer was no.
And you introduced instruments.
Yeah, it was a ukulele.
Yeah, it's a very small one. Yeah, last Sunday was our first time having an instrumental service.
And what instrument?
So they were like, we got instruments, no singing? Or do you mean instrumental like there was an instrument? Because I've been to an Anglican church when it's an instrumental service, you cry because it's Mozart and they hired professionals.
Yeah,
so,
no.
bro,
You
had
mean
a
like
whole
dude
band.
with a
whole
band.
band.
Like
Yes, whole
And
band.
did people
Long
freak
hair.
out?
There was... the people who were at the church before we introduced the idea are not all the same people who are there now. There's a few people who have left.
That's like wheat and chaff in it.
Yeah, something like that. But we
But
know
with
that
the
they're
G-chord.
at a great place with
So
the
how
Lord
do you
still.
go? That's like going from 0 to 60, man. You go like from total. How old is this congregation?
It's like 40 years old.
So 40 years, no instruments.
And what's
Yes.
your average age?
I don't know.
Older than the congregation?
Well, I would say it's a little bit old, but not Tony Jones old.
Oh, okay.
I'm definitely the oldest guy up here for the moment. For the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, of the people in your congregation, how many of them, what percentage of the people in your congregation, the congregants in the pews on Sunday,
Yes.
have ever heard of N.T. Wright or Greg Boyd?
I quote N.T. Wright a lot. I was actually
I'm asking how many people have heard of him. Because, I'm not saying that would be they actually listen to your sermons.
It's an assumption.
Well, in that way, I guess my sermons are kind of like your books. No one pays attention to either of them, right?
Hey, bro, as long as they buy them.
I know, that's
I don't
right.
care if they
Yeah.
read them,
Which
as
is
long as they buy
convenient.
them.
Hey,
It's convenient because Richard Beck's brand new book is right out there.
I don't care if you read it as long as you buy it.
Yeah. What's amazing, in heaven it counts that you read it if you buy 2 copies. Boom, shakalaka.
Well,
Yeah.
speaking of Church of Christ,
Yes.
can you give us a little, because we're about to have a Church of
I know.
Christ.
He already complained about my Twitter comments not even getting it straight.
We're about to have a Church of Christ author on the podcast. It's his inaugural time. Not on your. He's been on your podcast many times.
Yeah, many
I know.
times.
He'll
Well,
be
he's
on Tripp's
stepping up.
podcast for the first time.
That's exciting.
Give us a little background, because a little background on Church of Christ is
Yeah.
going to help us understand who Richard Beck is.
Let me tell you
better.
exactly what happened. Jesus created the church,
In what year?
33 A.D.,
Okay.
and we are the true descendants of that church. Just bypassed everything.
To like 1900 whatever.
Yeah, 06. Yeah, we
1906,
yeah.
like Restorationist
in
movement.
between 33
Yeah, what
and
happened in between?
1906. You're
Look.
kind of out of luck.
That's even like more confident than Hegel.
So
Well, if you got
Everyone
it,
that
flaunt it.
laughed, 5 nerd points. I appreciate it. That's right, 19th century German idealism. What? Schelling reference is coming next.
and 19th century German idealism would be an example of something that's not
Yeah.
of the church.
Yeah, thank you. I
It's
appreciate
probably
that.
not. It's probably not taught at their schools.
Yeah, you're going to have
Guessing.
to bring some of these down just a few levels for me, and I appreciate you doing that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So
Yeah.
Germany is a country in Europe.
Okay, got it.
When you say 19 something, that doesn't mean 19th century.
Gotcha. Well, it's great for you to fill me on some of these details. A few
Yeah.
other things I'd appreciate learning about that you guys know a lot is like Dungeons and Dragons. I know nothing about it.
Have you ever held a D20 in your hand, or is that too many? Is that too big for you?
I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
Probably like you got a lot of your listeners probably don't know what like prom was. So I could tell them about that too.
I mean, given that I was homecoming queen and went to 13 proms, when you're a competitive swing dancer and love Jesus so much they know you aren't going to try to screw them after they drink, you get invited by lots of hot chicks to prom. True story. I mean, I'm like not joking. I went to prom from sophomore year on at 3 different schools. They were like, he likes Jesus, but he knows how to swing dance.
That's
Luke.
Yeah. What do you want?
So he's going to tell you how far.
Before we bring Richard up here,
Yeah. What do we need to know about?
tell
him?
me
This
why
5-minute intro is going great.
Tell me why you like having Richard on your podcast so much, because we're about to bring him up here.
Okay, so on my podcast, do you guys know what Bill Simmons is? Sports pod? Sorry.
Yeah, for sure.
Sports, okay. He brings a guy named Chuck Klosterman on his quite often. Do you guys know Chuck Klosterman? He's written a bunch of stuff. I think Richard is the Chuck Klosterman to my podcast. He's brilliant. Whatever he says, I don't always understand it, but I know it's smart. So that's Richard. Brilliant.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, the author of Reviving Old Scratch, the book that just dropped today, which you're all going to go home with after you buy it. Richard Beck, everybody. Let's bring him up here. You go behind.
Am I going behind you?
Yep.
Richard, this is exciting. You should
I'm
show
scared, really.
everyone your pin. Show like Richard shows up at a book release party without a high quality pin to sign.
But you gave me
the book.
one.
I know. And so I got him a high quality jot, but it's red, so it matches your book cover.
it does match
So
my
it's
book
aesthetically exciting when you sign it. I found out that more people buy your book if you offer to sign it and or draw a picture of a duck. That's my new. So if you get my book, you're like, do you want me to sign it?
No,
Or a duck. I got a duck.
I have a good bunny
Or
rabbit.
a frog, true story.
I could do a frog.
That's all I got.
Yeah.
But so you wrote a book about Satan, but you are like an intelligent Christian who doesn't naturally run around worried about like demons, junk in your closet, like rolling Dungeons and Dragons dice, or like playing records backwards to find
Although
out how Satan's
I'm
in
a
there.
good. I played Dungeons and Dragons. And
I know that's what I'm talking about. You
and
don't
my aunt-
lose sleep about it.
I remember my aunt Barb walked by, and our cousins were playing it, and we were all fairly well accused of being Satan worshipers by my aunt Barb. And I said, hey, I'm just like an 11th level elf. Like that's
Ooh,
all.
but what class elf?
Like that's about.
Were you like
That's about as occult as it got.
a rogue, a ranger, magic, like?
I don't recall. I was more the dungeon master.
Ooh,
yeah, I was.
That's
I was,
the
I
one
was,
that tells stories
I was the
to
one that
make everyone's dice rolling turn into a communitarian experience of
like
fantasy
to-
excitement.
I have never felt more like a nerd than I do right now.
Yeah. Well, just imagine holding two big D20 in your hand and rolling them out, but it leads to like conquering Sauron or something.
No, I don't.
Yeah, he
I don't
doesn't
want to do
understand,
that
you know.
ever.
Yeah. So the origin of the book, as
Okay.
someone who, you're like a trained psychologist, like very critical thinking. The Enlightenment is not the arrival of like Satan for you. So, how in the world did you end up writing a book that
About
has
the devil?
demons and devil on the top?
I went. Part of it had to do with I started teaching a Bible study. Those are the guys that read my blog. I started teaching a Bible study out at a maximum security prison, and so I'm out there as a kind of fairly liberal, progressive type, and didn't have much use for Satan, demons, or whatever. But I find myself out there with inmates, and the spirituality they expressed was very charismatic, very Pentecostal, and they spoke about the devil and demon possession all the time. And I found myself stuck with an inability to use that language or speak about their experiences in a way that wasn't ironic or fake or like paternalistic. And I also found myself worshiping at a church that reaches out to people on the margins, a lot of people with addictions, homelessness, people on parole, similar kind of thing, very charismatic and Pentecostal. And I didn't want to be kind of like the educated, progressive liberal who listened to their language or prayer requests with kind of a wink.
Yeah.
So it was.
So you're saying you didn't want to patronize them by being more intelligent than them? Because personally, I don't know if that's always the wrong thing.
Yeah.
I really
I
maybe
hear
you can
that.
help me out. Like I thought that was
Yeah.
why I was hanging out with Luke. Was just to like, confused.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I don't know what to say about that.
So, Richard, I have a question for you. I read the book on the way out here today.
All right.
And,
It's a quick read, apparently.
great book. And so I read a
Mile-high
section in
reading.
here, and I thought you might have written this just for Tripp. True or false? Tell me if this is true.
Okay.
Page 39, third paragraph.
So everyone that bought the book but is yet to buy it, you can go ahead and write it on your hand.
Yeah.
Like it's always good to have something underlined and something.
Here it
you
is.
purchased.
The bad news is that you are a sinner bound for eternal damnation. Was that written just for Tripp?
That was, I think. Yes, it
Yeah,
was.
it
It was. As I
thought.
contemplate it now, it seems to fit.
Maybe I guess like you and my mother-in-law had a conversation.
So you make the argument that spiritual warfare in the Bible. Do I need to explain that to you guys? What that book is? The Bible?
It's like Lord of the Rings, but with Jesus.
Yeah, a lot like
okay.
that. It's a good library of books. You say that spiritual warfare is a political issue in the Bible. And so my question is, if we just finally get the right person in office, we make America great again. Can we finally dispel this idea that there's a myth of a Christian nation and actually fully become a Christian nation? Will that happen?
I think the devil dropped out of the race today. Is that right? Isn't that what happened?
Who dropped out?
Did Ted Cruz dropped out of the? Ted Cruz dropped out of the race, and so. He's still in. Oh, okay, all right. So
It's
John
huge.
Boehner had called Ted Cruz Lucifer in the flesh. Yeah.
Well,
But I guess he's still in. So there we go. Anyway.
So how is spiritual warfare political?
Well, I mean, I think it's more than political. I think that's a big part of the book. I think one of the arguments of the book, the first part of the book argues that progressives, liberals tend to politicize spiritual warfare, and they reduce it to social justice. So when they see themselves as fighting evil in the world, it's systemic evil, it's injustice. And so the first part of the book kind of makes that argument. That's what it looks like. But then it goes on from there to argue that there's more to it than just a political fight. And I think, Tom Wright's talk just over on campus a little bit ago kind of articulates that idea that if you lose the dramatic narrative of Jesus clashing with the Satan, you just lose contact with how Jesus envisioned the kingdom of God. And for liberals, progressives who find that Jesus' conflict with the Satan is somewhat of an embarrassment, or we don't really know what to do with it. It's mythological language. Then you have people who really love Jesus. I mean, if progressives love anything about Christianity, it's Jesus. Might not be the church.
I support Jesus.
Who doesn't? Who doesn't love Jesus? And yet they lack the part of Jesus' vision of the kingdom clashing against the Satan that galvanized kind of how he saw what he was up to or whatever. And so I think both Greg Boyd's work, and N.T. Wright's work were really influential in my journey in confronting that aspect about Jesus, and as it just became another influence on the book.
So in the book, you kind of like tell everyone how the right and left regularly misunderstands demons and the devil and Old Scratch, which if people haven't read the book, they're probably wondering who got a scar,
Old Scratch?
right? Because Old Scratch looks like a scar of a scratch that was deep. One, tell us who Old Scratch is, but also, when you read this book, if someone is more conservative or more progressive, like what are you hoping that makes them most uncomfortable?
Well, I think I've already talked about the liberal side. The liberal side is that spiritual warfare just equates synonymously with social justice. And so the book is trying to push back on that and suggest that there might be a spiritual aspect to what animates and holds together political or systemic injustices. And so it's pushing hard on liberals to suggest that there might be actually a spiritual component to spiritual warfare. But I try to give them language and metaphors that still maybe don't go all the way to believing in literal angels or demons, but it still allows them to use the language of spirituality. For conservatives, it is capturing the political side. It is capturing the fact that the principalities and powers are at work, and that the political aspect, and not reducing the devil or demons to. And this is where I'd push back on the people that I do worship with, or the men at the prison, when they do reduce demons and the devil to kind of disembodied spirits fighting out there. That is a kind of safe and tame way of thinking about evil, and missing the systemic aspects. And so it's trying to find this middle ground where both sides are going to kind of learn something a little bit about the battle with the Satan.
How does this view of Satan help people deal with suffering? Because as you describe in the book, there's sometimes people, when they intellectualize suffering, it leads them away from faith. Do you see a different way of understanding evil and the Satan as a way of helping people withstand and go through suffering?
Well, and I think that's something if Greg can speak about this a little bit, because that's kind of what struck me about his book. I don't know if you've read God at War, but the irony, I think, for a lot of progressive Christians is, and it's an argument I make in the book, is how our compassion in the face of suffering becomes an acid that burns faith away. The compassion we see in Jesus is the very thing that erodes faith in Jesus. Because as our compassion for suffering draws us into the pain of the world, the horror mounts as you're drawn deeper into it. And as the horror mounts, the theodicy pressures build up. And I think that's one of the tragedies of progressive Christianity, is the way that compassion undermines faith. And I think it's because we've turned evil into to use Greg's frame, a puzzle to be solved. Mm-hmm. Theodicy is a logical puzzle. And you can speak about process, how process goes about trying to solve that puzzle.
Yeah, don't tempt me. I mean, we'll be here till midnight.
We could get into, but I do think the common move is where you and Greg might agree is, people kind of work the omnipotent side. Mm-hmm. Where Greg might work it from the free will of spiritual agents, and process will work omnipotence a different way. I think that's where they do the work. They rethink power. All I have to say is, but rather than seeing evil as a puzzle to be solved, Greg's refrain in God at War is it's a reality to be resisted. It's a call to action, or what he calls a theology of revolt. And I think that's, for me, a big message in the book for liberals. I'm talking about liberal Christians, is to, most people who lose faith of my acquaintance lose faith over the problem of suffering.
Yeah.
And I think what they're lacking is this theology of revolt, this idea of that the only theodicy we get in the Bible isn't an explanation. It is a call to action. It's a call to the struggle. It's just a step into the drama. And so at some point you just got to take your doubts and shelve them and, act.
Well, what's amazing is the most people that have been ministers at some point recognize how horrible a theodicy answer to someone in the midst of a tremendous grief and suffering and pain is. You usually see it as a spectator, right? Like after a horrible funeral and someone's like, well, they needed another angel in heaven. And you're like, stab my face. Did they listen to my sermons? Or like, wow, God must have meant this for good. And you're like, yeah, God's kind of against cancer for small children. I don't know why you have to give God that's a compliment we don't need to throw to God about that type of power. But the other side of it that I think you bring up in the book really well is that the problem of evil, when that's a problem that has a rational conclusion, then you've left the spectrums of the way the biblical texts and narratives deal with the problem of evil. The problem of evil is not a problem to be solved, but one to be engaged with. And yet pastorally, there's always that temptation, right? To fix it up, wrap it up with a bow. And this nice little logical syllogism inspired by all sorts of whatever your favorite philosophers or theologians are. Mm-hmm. Is there
and I think that's a uniquely American thing too. I think Americans have so well, I don't know. I just try to use the word. I don't even think I know what I meant. Basically,
that's pretty normal for this podcast.
I'll say it simply, right? Being sad is a disease state in America. Let me say it that way. Does it make sense?
That's very tweetable. Say it again with gusto.
Being sad is a disease.
No, slower. So what? And then hold your book while you say it.
Sad.
Being.
Being sad is a. So there is we have a really, I think Americans are addicted to being happy. And so there is something about sadness and grief and just kind of sitting Shiva with each other in the grief that we are just incapable of doing. And I think the way it manifests theologically is to come up with an answer, right? That's a way to make it better quickly. And when we try to move quickly pastorally, we often do violence to each other emotionally.
So if you were an exorcist,
I mean, who doesn't like a question that begins that way?
Which is a good story.
There's a story in the book where
But that's not the story I want to go to right
to
now.
cast out a demon.
But if you were an exorcist, what would be your go-to move? You really...
would be my go-to move.
Yeah.
Like
a
see,
a
he's already
finisher.
starting to sound like a role-playing game.
Yeah, yeah.
You got to roll for your special moves. You're like, do you want the Holy Ghost kapow?
Yeah.
Singing.
Now-
Singing.
Sing what?
In your book, you talk about singing. If you were an
Oh,
exorcist...
singing.
Do I need to go to the page number
Yeah,
and pull
no,
this
I'll do
quote
the
out
singing.
for you?
You did write it,
So
right?
in the book,
You need a better editor.
in the
Oh,
yeah.
how does worship help?
So in the book, I talk about that Satan doesn't just tempt us morally. The Satan isn't just a moral tempter, but is also trying to, cause us to give up on hope. And see, this is something I discovered out at the prison. This is another thing. So I came in, I use the words, if you guys have read my blog, I talk about somebody being a winter Christian. I don't know if anybody knows that language, but a winter Christian in my language is somebody who kind of mixes a lot of lament in with their spirituality, okay? And that's kind of my default. Like I will go to lament, I will go to kind of the dark thread of Christianity very easily. It's just kind of my default. And I get this kind of from Walter Brueggemann, right? So there's prophetic rebuke and anger, but there's also grief and lamentation. But there's also hope. Like he came up with a recent book, I think it was called Reality. Was it Grief, Reality, Hope? Anyway.
Is that the one he quotes you in?
Thank you. Yes, he does. That's why it's my favorite book that Walter Brueggemann has ever written. And anyway, but the reason I helped Walter come to this insight is
you mean other than he called?
Exactly. Why'd you mention that? This is just embarrassing. Anyway, but no, so I go out to the prison, and the very first Bible study I was ever going to do out there, I was thinking to myself, what's good material? Like, these guys are in prison. Let's do a series on the lament psalms, right? They could connect with that. They're in prison. So I start doing that. I start going through the grief and the questioning of God, the accusation, Brueggemann's Psalms of disorientation, and I get about 30 minutes into it, and the prisoners are like, whoa, wait. Like, we get it. Prison sucks. Like we are aware that, where we are, and I was like, so, this is me kind of a progressive, fairly educated, happy person, okay. So they're like, what we need is a little hope. And I was like, I don't really do that. I mean, I don't like really, it's not kind of my normal, it's not a natural move for me, and so the singing, so what happened in the singing is they had these hymnals. If you've read my blog, you know these stories. And so they have these hymnals on the
Tell them your blog URL.
experimentaltheology.blogspot.
You're so
At
old
Juno.
school.
Yeah, it's a experimentaltheology@blogspot.com. I'm still on Blogspot. It's free.
I have blog posts.
But anyway, so they had these hymnals on the thing, and we started pulling them out, singing them. So we do this kind of every Monday night. In Abilene, Texas, we do this old-fashioned hymn sing, and those have become really life-giving moments for me and them, because it's where we kind of reclaim hope, and that's not a natural move for me.
But you're a therapist.
Because I'm a therapist. I'm actually not a therapist. I got out of that gig pretty early.
Hey, but if it's close enough, it counts for
it's
jokes.
true.
That's how
that's
this
true.
works.
When I was in supervision, that was the number one complaint I got from my supervisor when I was a therapist, training to be a therapist, was like, Richard, you talk too much for a therapist. And I was like, well, I'm trying to help. Like,
honestly,
well, you should listen to their problems first. Like, well, no, I know what they need to hear.
I understand. People should listen.
So I became a professor.
Yeah. And you're like, do you want to waste your student
now I can
loans?
just
Listen and repeat.
Yeah. Now I can just talk and people write down what I say. And
Praise
it
the
feels
Lord.
good.
I know.
It helps my self-esteem.
Amen.
Anyway,
And
so
you don't have to ever run a capital campaign.
Anyway, so I've learned out there that to sing all of the poetry of the prophets. I think everybody, I wrote a post about this a couple months ago, but everybody has a natural song. For some people, it's the social justice warriors, anger, rebuke at the principalities and powers. That's like like you can sing that song in your sleep. That's your go-to song. You can sing it. It's natural. And some of it's grief, lamentation. It's sitting in sackcloth and like that's our go-to. Like sadness is we get that. And some of us, our natural song is hope. Like you probably worship with people that their natural song. And I think to be a mature Christian, you got to learn to sing all those songs, even the ones that aren't natural for you, because it's all about timing. Like when is a certain song. So at the prison, singing they need some hope. So I've gotten a little bit better at being hopeful. Yeah.
Well, at the end, like when you start to like revision spiritual warfare, and you start to talk about the invasion of love, you talk about like a different vision of power. All sorts of the regulars on Homebrewed Christianity, like either like Jürgen Moltmann, Open Theist, or Roger Olson starts popping in my head, to like John Cobb, to even like Jack Caputo and weak power, and so can you describe like what it is that's resonating in people from like rather Orthodox Christians to ones that aren't, in this revisioning of divine power that helps us understand the nature of divine love, which you're talking about in this. I felt uncomfortable liking a chapter about spiritual warfare. That's honestly what it is. We might have to edit this out of the podcast.
That's the best endorsement. There you go.
Like I didn't know what to do. I had to text a Pentecostal friend. He's left messages on my phone before trying to give me the gift of the Holy Ghost. And I didn't know what to do, and I was like old Scratch, and he's like, whoa, and I was like, no, it's the name of the book.
And the question is, yeah. I mean,
weak power, invasion of love.
Yeah,
you should be a therapist.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't. No, I can't. I don't know if I can speak to all the theologians you just ticked off.
I know, but if you pick parts of it, maybe edit out everything else I said that you didn't talk about, and it'll look reasonable.
Right. But I do think I make a similar move to some process people at the end. I don't use process theology, but I mainly use the idea that if God's power in the world is love, then if love is always experienced as weakness, then it's always contestable. It's always fragile and fleeting. It's always, does it make sense? It has to insert itself. And so I use the idea of the apocalypse of love. Love is an invasion. It is or C.S. Lewis's phrase is, right? The gospel story is that the rightful king has landed in disguise, and is now calling us to participate in a great campaign of sabotage. And that idea of sabotage is guerrilla warfare. Love is inserting itself into a world that's been dominated by the principalities and powers. And because it's weakness, it's always got to be something that's paradoxically fought for. It's not going to establish itself naturally. It won't be the steady state, if that makes sense. And so it's got to be, connecting back with the theology of revolt. It's got to be an intentional practicing and insertion of love. St. John of the Cross put it really well. Where there is no love, put love. That's spiritual warfare. That is the apocalypse of love, this great campaign of sabotage. And so I do think that idea of the weak power, I do think I don't make the connection, but I think it fits really well with process thought.
All beautiful and good things. So what we're going to do is we're going to transition, and when that happens, Tony, you're going to scoot down here because we're going to share this mic, because for some reason 2 mics that tested an hour ago stopped working, and NT Wright's going to grab this one when he sits between us. But in the midst of that transition, we're all going to do a thing called clapping as we go to get Reviving Old Scratch, if for some reason we have not ordered it on our Amazon app right now. And remember, he has a beautiful red pen right here. Yeah, and he's ready to draw a picture of a frog. Have you ever bought a book from an author and got a picture of a frog? That's right.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Nice job.
Thank you, sir.
Go test that one real quick. He just unmuted it.
Where am I going?
This one, yeah, the switch is on.
All right.
You're gonna go.
Tony, come here.
I'll come down here with Luke. You can have time.
Where do you want me?
Right there.
Right there.
So 4 and 5 work.
This now works.
So 3 is out.
So both of those work. Okay, excellent.
You're switching me.
No.
All right. 0407. All right. So if you're saying to yourselves right now, WTF, is that NT Wright? Because I read lots of his books and he helps me understand the Bible, and that's almost amazing. Then you should put your hands together, and if you haven't, pretend you did. Woo, woo, woo! It's exciting because it's only been 820 episodes of Homebrewed Christianity since NT Wright's been on, but he said yes before.
He's been
I was
avoiding
cool.
you, Tripp.
I know. No. Oh yeah, I forgot. Oh yeah. So if you haven't seen this, Thingamabob, and you live in Los Angeles, pick it up because the first week of August we have Adult Vacation Bible School with Walter Brueggemann. There will be hand motions and crafts, and if you're a minister of some sorts, there's going to be workshop sections where you take his introduction to the Hebrew Scriptures back home to use in your congregation. So use one of those things and pick which felt board cutout I found that looks like Walter Brueggemann, because I paid extra just to be able to legally put it on stuff. And if you find the picture on the internet or text it and tag him, I'll enjoy it even more. Because who doesn't want to have a felt board version of Pharaoh that looks like you tagged on you on Facebook? Luckily, there's none that looks like N.T. Wright, but that's because he covers the New Testament.
What is he even talking about? I don't know what's going on right here.
Let's just have you hold it so that we don't have to worry about.
Okay.
All right, Luke.
First of all, I appreciate you being a good sport with this. I don't know what you're thinking right now, but
he already edited half of what we're gonna do out. Like
that's smart.
No, Luke did.
Oh, see.
Yeah, I mean, I would have. The first time I interviewed you, I brought a sidekick of mine, and he referred to you as Brother Tom the whole time. And you were a good sport with that, so I knew you'll be a good sport right now.
Once you've been a bishop for a few years, you learn to be a good sport about a lot of things. Yeah.
As a bishop, did they prepare you for stuff like this right here?
Not exactly, no. I think had I seen what was on offer,
you would have worn your tennis shoes for sheer excitement.
Or my purple shirt, yeah, I missed that as well.
5 points.
That's good. So as we're discussing the accuser, the devil.
Yeah.
What's your first thought as you hear all this discussion about it?
Well, my first thought was that that's why Fortress sent me a copy of this book a couple of weeks ago. And because, books just come in the whole time.
You did. I will say, as a Fortress Press representative,
You had
when I
emailed
pitched
me.
you when I pitched you this idea of coming to this thing.
Yeah, I know. Enough
You
apologies.
said
Yeah.
I'd love to see the book that we're going to be talking about.
But the trouble is, 3 weeks, 6 weeks down the road,
Right, exactly.
there was a lot of other water under the bridge.
You also said,
grandchild.
I've just found out that my wife won't be coming with me to L.A., so I guess I'm good for a couple beers and a podcast.
I think actually you've scaled that down. It wasn't beer you promised; it was gin, and you failed on that promise.
Gin is still. I have failed so much.
That's why I'm here, because Tony promised me gin.
I did promise gin.
It's not there. That's not. No, it's just not. Anyway, so
it is noble.
We're going to be having Pepperdine gin later in the week.
So in the middle of everything else I was trying to do before coming here, I did read the first half of this book, and I much enjoyed it. I mean, flattering. Is Richard there?
Richard's there.
He's disappeared somewhere.
He's definitely going to listen to this multiple times.
He actually just fainted when you said that you'd read the first half of his book.
No, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to me because of his prison work. My wife used to work in the prison service. You know, we had these surreal conversations at the end of the day, like. I would say, I had lunch with the bishop today, and she would say, I had lunch with 2 mass murderers today. And we thought, how does that work? And so I have thought quite a bit over the last decade or two about just the inner dynamics of what it means to be in prison. And my wife used to work with lifers, with long-term prisoners and so on. Simultaneously, I've thought quite a lot about the whole demons and devil business, because one of the things that happens when you turn up as a bishop is you get this quiet little visit from a team of 2 or 3 or 4 clergy in your diocese who you didn't know, but they are the deliverance team, and it's under the radar, and they don't make a fuss about it, but the bishop has to know because the bishop has to authorize it. And I learned a lot from them because it's never been part of my ministry. I'm very glad to say I'm quite happy not to be dealing with that, but I had 250 parishes in my diocese, and from time to time, funny things happen in this parish or that. People get hurt. Somebody wonders what's going on. And thank God that there are people who will say their prayers, who have got other people praying for them, who will go in and do what's necessary. And I'm not a specialist at all. I don't know. But some of you will remember a long time ago, Scott Peck, famous for The Road Less Traveled. He wrote a book called People of the Lie. And he, as a therapist, started off with the assumption that there's no such thing really as demon possession and all that. And as a therapist, he was forced to admit that though in many cases this isn't actually what's going on, there is a residuum of cases where you just have to say something else is happening here which is dark and quite different from the other things which we might face. So, I mean, I've always taken that view. I think C.S. Lewis says somewhere, I think it's in Miracles, that he uses the illustration. Of course, he'd lived through 2 wars. He said it's like we know when there's a war on that there are enemy spies around, but we probably don't want to believe all the tittle-tattle on the street about, oh, so-and-so's a spy or whatever. And in the same way, we should recognize that there are dark powers that we just need to watch out for, which is one of the many reasons why we say our prayers and pray, deliver us from evil and so on. But we don't want to believe everybody who comes up and says, ooh, there's a demon behind that bush, or, oh, there's a demon who caused such and such, or whatever. So there you are. You asked me a short question. I've given you a long answer. That's
we should let Richard Beck pause because anytime N.T. Wright says, I read the first half of your book, that's like a life achievement moment.
Well, you need to know it's 5 a.m. in my body clock. So if I'm just rabbiting on, that's why. So
well, hey, Tom, can I ask you a question, though? Because one of the things that made me, in my book, kind of take this seriously was reading Greg's work, but it was also reading yours, Jesus and the Victory of God. Okay. And the way you just kind of articulated over there on the campus, the way you framed, and I mentioned this in my discussion, as Jesus seeing his battle is fundamentally against the Satan, not against the Romans. And I think it's an interesting move for liberals because of our emphasis on social justice. There is a temptation to zealotry and wanting to fight against the bad guys. In that case, the colonial oppressors would have been the Romans. And Jesus deflects that battle into a cosmic sphere and achieves a nonviolent solution.
I think that's exactly right. But it's very difficult because there are times when the colonial powers, or indeed other powers, do get taken over and do find themselves being the cat's paw of some dark force. So it's never an either or. And so one of the difficulties about the New Testament exegesis of the relevant passages, somebody asked me about this earlier today, about the principalities and powers. Sometimes it seems as though in Ephesians, for instance, Paul is saying, we're not fighting against flesh and blood. It's something else going on here. But other times, and I think John is one of them, you see a convergence, so that Judas is actually embodying the accusatory force. Pilate, in his debate with Jesus, is being, doing, as it were, the devil's work without realizing that this is how it's all going to turn the other way. So I think part of the deal is that we, in the nature of the case, don't understand it. And I think we make it harder for ourselves in the post-Enlightenment Western world. Precisely, a very interesting discussion you were having before about the problem of evil. And I did some research on this a while ago for a book I was writing, and it was a revelation to me that in the middle of the 18th century, really because of things like the Lisbon earthquake, that the thing splits so that now we think of Jesus dying for my sins, so my evil gets dealt with by Jesus, thank you very much. And then there is this quite other thing called the problem of evil, and we deal with it with theodicy and all that. And I think that is a novum. I don't think that happens until about the 18th century. And because we are all still in cultures dominated by the Enlightenment, we still think of that split. And I want to say, no, for goodness sake, bring them back together and see it as the dark and mysterious thing that it is. That splitting, classic Enlightenment Epicureanism, is a way of making life a bit easier for a while, but it then gets a lot harder afterwards. And I think we're in exactly that moment right now. I've said enough.
No, you brought that up. And so, ironically, yesterday, having only read your academic books, a friend of mine said, you do know he wrote a book about evil.
Oh, okay.
And I was like, really? Because Luke and I prepared a whole walk through all of his big books published by Fortress, where I found a passage in all of the big books based on Satan, demons, or something, and we were going to have fun and have you summarize them articulately in academic-ese, and he was going to ask you a pastoral question. But then I downloaded the ebook, and now I have a question that's exactly that you pointed out.
Okay.
And here it is. So, like 2 parts. One, explain how the Enlightenment gave so many Western Christians the ability to think that human beings are rational agents with free choice who, if informed correctly, would make a good decision, and that 9/11 cluster cursed all of our ability to keep believing
I still have a job.
that is that's a rational myth to believe in.
Yeah.
It's chapters 1 and 2.
Yeah, it probably is. I mean, as I say, I think you can't generalize because these are huge, vast movements. It's different in France from Germany, from America, from Britain, etc.
There was a passage where you talked about, like, after 9/11, then Tony Blair externalizes evil, labels it, and then goes axis of evil and all that kind of stuff.
From my point of view, sitting in London where I was working when all that happened, it was really very striking that Tony Blair's early rhetoric when he was first Prime Minister in 1997, was really, we've got rid of those stupid Tories, the Conservatives. We, New Labour, are now the people who understand the way the world is and what needs to be done to solve things. And there was this wonderfully naive belief that somehow the forces of progress had sort of swept evil away, and then 9/11 happened, and oh my goodness, there's a bit of evil still out there. What are we going to do? We'll go and drop bombs on it. That'll be all right. That'll sort it. And he had this extraordinary speech in 2001, just after 9/11, when he was talking like this, and it was basically messianic. And that strikes me as deeply, deeply dangerous. And I'm not saying anything I haven't said many times in public in the UK. So even if this does go viral, it's nothing new. But to watch, and here was the real tragedy, I think, that out of the Western world, there were only 2 countries who had leaders who described themselves as Christians. And those were the 2 countries who were adopting this amazingly naive, simplistic attitude. There is evil out there, we will go and deal with it. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, hang on, in the Bible, God deals with evil. And the way he does it is through Jesus being crucified. And until you put that at the center and work out from there, then it's probably blasphemous to say we're going to deal with evil without giving that as the root.
Mm-hmm. I think you have a quote in there that the line of good and evil is never between us and them. And I think you're quoting someone else.
I'm quoting Solzhenitsyn.
Oh, of course.
It's after the fall of the old Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn came back into Russia as it then was. And people were wanting him to say, oh, those are the wicked guys there. And he said, nope, I've suffered at their hands, but actually the jagged line between good and evil runs right through all societies and all people.
So we typically want to project it and say it's the evil's over there.
Yeah.
How do we move past that and say the evil is there, but it's also in me too?
Well, the danger with that, of course, is you collapse back into an old kind of 60s liberalism where you just say we're all guilty, and then nothing happens. It's a way of copping out, actually, because there are things which are done in the world which are radically evil, and we have to recapture the ability to say that while recognizing that we are not the high and mighty ones who have got it all right, and that we get a lot of stuff wrong as well. That's why stuff has to be done in public, like history has to be done in public, because otherwise people will deceive themselves.
What do you mean done in public?
Well, I mean, it has to be done with proper debate and dialogue. You mentioned Al Gore before. He wrote a book a few years ago on the decline of reason. It was something like that. But it was basically on how contemporary, it's a postmodern thing, that we don't do reason anymore. We lob verbal or emotional hand grenades over the wall at one another. And, our political discourse is like that. Seems to me yours is as well right now. But that's...
we might trump you on that.
Yeah. Thank you. I was carefully avoiding doing that.
So when you wrote a book on evil, and in it you talk about the experience of writing a book on evil, and your conversation with Maggie, and I'm interested in how you and how does this writing a book on evil, demons, and stuff? What was the experience?
It was the book got written because after I did the lectures on the resurrection and all that, which eventually turned into Surprised by Hope, I thought the obvious thing to do is write the book on the cross. That's been delayed until right now. But I as I was thinking about it, I thought, actually, you can't write about the cross unless you got a clear idea of what evil is and if God is dealing with it. So I gave some lectures in Westminster Abbey on evil. And that was 2003. And then they turned into the book, Evil and the Justice of God. Mm-hmm. But it's funny, my wife, Maggie, who is responsible for many good things in my life, put her finger on it. She said, because they wanted me to make a television program about it as well, which I did. And she said, you're not going to make a television program about evil. Said, you do that, bad things are going to happen. And I said, oh, sweetheart, you're just being superstitious. Mm-hmm. And it was a very, very difficult year. I wouldn't want even to tell you half of it, but 2005 was all sorts of things happened, which, okay, they're coincidences. They just all happened to cluster around that time. I feel the same about the book I'm finishing on the cross at the moment, and the lectures I'm doing at Pepperdine. I actually got a team of people to pray for me around that because I just thought, I don't want to go into this mess unguarded. And I'm quite sort of unemotional about that mostly, but I just have learned over the years that yeah, stuff happens. Mm-hmm. Somebody said that.
No, I would agree. I mean, I just think I think the world gets a little bit more haunted for you, and you just, I think you become more humble in what you think you actually know is a fact or not. And so you let go a little bit of the kind of the disenchantment. And the word disenchantment in my book is that just borrowed from Charles Taylor's use of
secular age.
The secular age. And so your world becomes a little bit more spooky and enchanted, and things on the edges are a little less certain.
And it's funny that it should be demons that are making that happen rather than angels. But
Now, can I jump in with a question? Can I? For Brother Tom.
Yeah, I mean, since it
Brother
is your
Tom,
book
because
release.
my preacher's back here, he calls him Brother Tom, so I'm going to call you Brother Tom. But when I hear you describe the cosmic conflict, that makes me just think of apocalyptic and Pauline scholarship. But I know you get beaten up from some of those apocalyptic scholars, and so not
Look, it's very late.
No, it's all right. It's okay.
But does that make sense? Though, but it seems like to me you are
this is an ad for my most recent Fortress book, which is Paul and his recent interpreters,
which you can purchase
Which
right
is
out
on
there
sale
right
for
now.
sale. Okay, but so can you speak about that? Because when I hear you describe Jesus and the Satan, it sounds very apocalyptic in Lewis Martin's vision. But then, so I don't know if. Can you speak about that maybe misunderstanding or debate? That might be a little inside baseball, but
well, it's tough because there's been endless debates over the last 20 years about simply what this blessed word apocalyptic means and how we should use it. And to put it crudely, and this is part 2 of the book Paul and his recent interpreters, those who currently write in Pauline scholarship and say we are giving you the apocalyptic view have distanced themselves from actual first century Jewish apocalyptic and have made something they call apocalyptic, which is really a sort of Bartianism, which is about nothing good coming out of history and God simply having to invade. Martin used the word invade all the time, in a way which denies the historical continuum entirely. And it's really frustrating because what they're reacting against is not actual first century Jewish views, but against Hegelianism, against the idea of a progress which is going on, which will gradually get where it's going. I get accused of that, which is rubbish. I've never taken that view. But when you look at what many first century Jews who wrote books we call apocalyptic, 1 Enoch, 4th Ezra, 2 Baruch, whatever, they are telling the story of Israel as a dark and tragic story, and they are seeing God's purpose working nevertheless through that towards something which is not simply the apex of a climactic pyramid, but is a new thing and yet is the thing which was promised. One of my graduate students said it like this. He said, God acts surprisingly, shockingly, startlingly, as he always said he would. In other words, you've got to say both those things at once. And the trouble with the Martin thing is that I think it's getting traction. But tell me if I'm wrong about this. I've asked 1 or 2 people in that school, why is this stuff so popular? Granted that it is not, in fact, rooted historically, which it isn't. And I think part of the answer is it appears to be a way of reading Paul without being a fundamentalist. Because the fundamentalist will say, Jesus died for my sins so that I can go to heaven and all of that. And they say, no, this is God's victory over evil and it's much more dramatic than that.
How much of it do you think is like the sexiness of attaching that reading to weird atheist philosophers' readings of Paul?
Well,
Now,
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
obviously a super nerdy moment, but for all of you that were in the high gravity philosophers reading Paul class, you'll notice that all 5 of the atheist philosophers that read Paul will love Martin's apocalyptic version precisely for that.
They
thing.
may. I don't think Giorgio Agamben is an atheist.
No, he's not.
No, quite.
But like
he is,
Badu, Zizek, anyway, Thomas.
But the lights went on for me.
That was just so much fun. Anyway,
What was fun?
no, that you were like correcting me on Agamben. I was like, no, he's not. But like the fact that we just had that exchange, I was like, that's awesome. Because Pete and I'd argued about whether we have him, and I was like, no, you can't have Agamben. He's not an actual atheist. And Pete's like, yeah, he is. I was like, no, he's not. Have you had to check this? And then we were like, yeah, I win.
You have to
And
read.
he right agrees. Check it, Pete Rollins.
You have to.
Someone tweet him right now.
You have to read his book on the kingdom of God. Agamben's
Exactly.
Yeah. But the thing is this. The tragic figure in the middle of the century is Walter Benjamin.
Yes.
And Walter Benjamin, it was, who has this awful moment at the start of the Second World War because he has really believed, or half believed through his friendship with Sholem, that something really good is going to come out of the progress of history. And there are a lot of people in Europe in the 20s and 30s who thought that. Some of them were communists who thought that that's where it was going. Others were Nazis who thought that that's where it was going. And so when Hitler and Stalin have their pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in late 1939, Benjamin just sees this is the end. And so he writes that tragic final piece, which is that no good thing is coming out of history. And he has Paul Klee's thing of the angel of history, the angel, which just
He's
says...
walking backwards looking down.
That's right. And history is a pile of rubbish and something radically new has got to happen. Now, this is the failure of an atheist Jewish dream, as in Walter Benjamin.
Yes!
But the tragedy of this is that this was picked up by people like Kaiserman, for whom I have enormous respect. But Kaiserman was imprisoned by the Nazis. I mean, he was a hero.
Disciples aren't always perfect on their exegesis.
Absolutely.
It's okay.
Peter. But the point. The point is, in New Testament scholarship, the idea that the early church were expecting the second coming and were disappointed. This is a modern myth resonating with the modern post-Hegelian, post-Marxist myth of the failure of expectation.
I feel uncomfortable agreeing with you so much. It's going to ruin my progressive street cred. This is like awesome.
You're uncomfortable about you agreeing with me. How do you think it makes me feel? But so I mean, basically, back to the apocalyptic thing. Yes. There's a lot of this stuff which is out there, and I think it's ill-informed.
Okay, yeah, I hear you saying.
But I mean, the trouble is, I really do want to say Paul is, in the right Jewish sense, an apocalyptic thinker. But that doesn't mean he doesn't believe in salvation history in some sense. It doesn't mean he doesn't believe in justification by faith, as Douglas Campbell thinks, etc. There's a huge amount of misconceptions, and you just need to sift and shake them until they gradually come back into shape.
How many pages in the Campbell's book were you just irritated?
Oh,
like I started reading, and once you start checking the footnotes,
probably about as many pages as he was irritated in my book. So I mean,
So you said you're working on a book on the cross. How would you understand this? Like a theology of the cross. Like you've been in lots of battles over theologians very worried about being always on Paul's side. And then in the 20th century, there's been this revival of theology of the cross that revises suffering, divine power, these type of things. How do you think a Pauline theology of the cross and the early churches wrestling with it would kind of engage those conversation points?
It's a huge question, probably too big for this evening. I tried to say
That's
something
why
about
it's a book.
I tried to say something about this at Pepperdine just now, very briefly. Paul never says the same thing twice about the cross, and many of the passages which have become famous in Western Protestantism don't actually quite mean what the Protestant tradition wants them to mean, because we've taken them and I mean, parade example, Galatians 3:13, the Messiah became a curse for us because it says, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, and most people in Western Protestant churches assume that the next line is going to be so that we could be delivered from the guilt and penalty and power of sin. It's not what Paul says. He says, so so that the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentiles and we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. And if you went down the wrong road after verse 13, it shows that the controlling narrative in your head is wrong. Paul sees the cross as the thing which basically deals with, as I said this evening, with the powers that have enslaved the world. The Gentile mission can happen because the powers who enslaved the world have in principle been defeated on the cross. And I know the phrase in principle is a kind of a weasel phrase, which means I'm really not quite sure what to say about this, but I want to say it anyway. But something has happened as a result of which there is this radical new possibility. And you see that again and again. So I think with Paul, there is a convergence of saying, and it's Galatians 1:4, which Lou Martin divides up. The Messiah died for our sins to deliver us from the present evil age. You need both, and you need to understand how both work together. Otherwise, the thing just falls apart.
So we need to balance out Tripp over here and bring in an actual pastor to the conversation. So Greg, thank you for joining us. Thanks for getting my back up here. Ever knows Greg Boyd? Yes?
Hi.
Yes?
Hi.
So we've been talking a lot up here. Just a ton of talking.
A lot of talking.
And for a pastor, it's hard for you not to be the one talking. I mean, that's part of what we do is we talk.
They pay me to talk, yes.
Yes. So where do you want to jump in on this? There's a lot.
Yeah. The only thing I guess I'd say, I'm not a Paul scholar, so I'm not going to weigh in on the details of that. But going back a little bit, when you're talking about how it's a fundamental aspect of the narrative that I think has been more often than not underappreciated, underemphasized in Western theology, that Jesus entered into this thing as part of a cosmic battle and to bring an end to this cosmic war. And if that gets marginalized or just eradicated because it's too hard for modern people to believe in, you fundamentally change the meaning of the cross, the meaning of the gospel, the meaning of everything. So I don't see the belief in the demonic realm, Satan, principalities and powers, elemental forces, all of that, as being just part of the trappings of the gospel. It really affects the core of it.
Yeah. And I think, did you know Walter Wink, the late great Walter Wink? Yeah. Because Walter was a good friend of mine, and many conversations we've had down this line, he had a real struggle because he could see that in the fundamentalist world, people were wanting to blame everything on demons doing this, that. And he would say, no, that's not what we're talking about. And he was very keen on this idea that, and which I think I'm trying to re-inhabit from perhaps a slightly different angle, that, as I said this evening, humans are given by God the power to reflect God's love into the world. But when we worship idols, we make over that power to things which don't have any power of their own.
Right.
So idols work on borrowed power, and they keep that because they make us do what they want us to. And so only when the grip of sin is defeated can the idols be robbed from their power. I think Walter would have agreed with that. I wish he was still alive so we could ask him. But how are you with that? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes total sense. My worry about Wink is that he wanted to hold on to the reality of the demonic. He had a sense about that both in the narrative and in the world. But on the other hand, he wanted to kind of reduce it to social categories. So it's the interiority of social groups and the esprit de corps groups. And at that point, then you take away really any sort of ontological over and againstness towards humanity. And I wouldn't be comfortable with that.
No, I think I agree with that. But I think that the whole conversation in the Western Church is still taking place, if we're not careful, within the split-level world of the Epicurean Enlightenment vision, where God, angels, anything else is a long way away, and the world just goes on its merry way down here.
Yeah.
And that's and the funny thing is, people think that's a modern view. It isn't. It's Lucretius in the 1st century BC. Very clear. And evolutionism, as opposed to evolution, goes with that. That is, evolutionism as an ideology that says it must be so and there must be no invasion from elsewhere.
Right.
Whereas when we look at the biblical, I think, a biblical worldview in which heaven and earth actually overlap and interlock uncomfortably and sometimes apparently disorganizedly from our point of view, then there are all sorts of dangerous possibilities as well as positive possibilities. And that's where I would locate it. And that helps me a little bit in terms of finding appropriate language. Whereas if you have that split level thing, it just falls apart.
Yep. Good.
We're agreeing. Something must be done about this.
I'm glad I could bring you two together. Richard, you're sitting over there awfully quiet right now.
Oh, hey, this is a dream. I'm sitting talking to like two heroes of mine. So,
Three?
But hey, so yeah. Sorry. So, but Greg, you read the book, and thank you for doing that. But so how do you feel about the way I handle it? And be honest, because I'm kind of walking this middle ground to rehabilitate the demonic or the satanic for a skeptical audience. And so I might not have the ontological againstness part really strong. But anyway, so...
Well, what I'd say basically is, in this insightful and highly important masterpiece, Beck helps... There you go. Did you read the back of your book?
I did.
Dude, I endorsed you. What more do you want? Could you repeat what you said before?
But you guys disagree, and when I saw that you endorsed the book, I was glad. But
I didn't want to hurt his feelings. You know,
That's
it's like-
not-
what I think. What?
No.
Okay, but
Okay, here's why.
Okay,
You were, I think, in this book, sort of like a Schleiermacher on the demonic. You guys feel like Schleiermacher was trying to translate some of the realities of Christianity to his culture. And so he wrote that letters to the cultural despisers things, and that's kind of what this is. I think we're all in process, and I know Richard's in process, and he's. And this is a work in process, and he's inviting others in on this process, and he's moving in the right direction. I would affirm much more than he affirms, but he's kind of saying, look, you can appreciate there's a reality here. It's kind of like a Kantian ding on sick. It's the thing that's in and of itself. We can't see anything more about it than that there's something there. And so he's kind of saying there's something there. But of course, we're paranoid about thinking of it with, horns and red and pitchfork and hoofs. And so we have to kind of demythologize from some of that. But, you don't need to figure all that out to get in the game. That's what I liked about it. He's saying, take that next step, open your eyes, get involved in this revolt. Even if you're not sure what the heck you're revolting against, it's evil. And so I think it was good.
but Richard, someone could read your book and not know ultimately where you land on the question of, do you actually think there is a devil or not? Do you think?
Yeah, that'd be correct. The book would be agnostic about that.
So, why did you? Newsworthy with Newsworthy, where we actually have microphones. Why did you feel okay to leave that open-ended and not answer that question?
I was writing something on the plane about this the other day, and some of it has to do with my being a social scientist. And so, I lecture. This is going to be really nerdy, but
what part of this hasn't been really nerdy?
Yeah, right. That's true. That was a moment, you two, where I was completely lost. But I lecture on dreams, and we can describe, the stages of sleep and REM sleep and sleep paralysis, and we can describe dreams really well. But then inevitably a student raises their hand and says, "Why do we dream?" And I go, "Well, nobody really knows. There's multiple theories out there, and nobody really knows. But we can describe it very scientifically." And so I think psychologists are very used to being very good at describing the situation on the ground and being somewhat okay with multiple explanations. And so I think that's kind of the way I wrote the book. I said, I agree that there is something, a lived reality. There's something we're bumping up against. There are these things that everybody could agree on, even if they kind of might be ultimately part ways on ontology. And I'm just comfortable with that. Now, I don't know if lots of people are comfortable with that, but so the book was trying to kind of from the ground up say liberal or conservative, fundamentalist, charismatic, or, somebody who's kind of a Christian atheist, that we can all agree that in the words of the great Pat Benatar, love is a battlefield.
Yeah.
Is that right?
So Dr. Wright, how do you feel about there being a generous orthodoxy about the actual existence of the devil or the non-existence of the devil?
Wrong question.
Idiot.
But it was the fourth word in the sentence that was wrong. You said, "How did I feel?" And the answer is, right now I'm feeling all sorts of things, but they're nothing to do with that. So I think what you meant was how do I think about it, which is at least a coherent question which I can address.
No, my dad's a psychologist. I was taught to ask, "How do you feel?"
Yeah, I'm sure. But when I was Bishop of Durham, sometimes the Archdeacon would say, Bishop, I feel very strongly. I say, I really don't care how you feel about it. Tell me how you think about it. Oh, okay. You can't. I mean, it's actually a serious point. What's happened in our discourse? This is a different question, but it's at this time of night, I'm going to get away with it anyway.
That's what I'm talking about.
Our discourse has done exactly that because it feels kinder. Instead of saying, I think you're wrong, you say, I feel, I have some issues about that one. And it becomes actually talking about me and my interiority rather than talking about the issue.
Feelings, nothing more than feelings.
Absolutely. But what we do is we say I feel when we mean I think, but then we collapse thinking into feeling, and that's the beginning of that postmodern thing I said before, where we don't actually discuss real issues. We don't know how to marshal arguments. We don't know how to deduce evidence. So, I mean, in terms of thinking about the devil, I think one of the things which seems to be clear in the New Testament and in a lot of the experience of people I know who've had more experience of this than me is that actually the demonic, the devil, the demons, whatever, are deceptive, they are mean, they hide, they don't do what you might think logically they should do. So just when you think, here is some clear evidence of this, then it'll be a bit wishy-washy, a bit uncertain. And in that context, the only safe way of going at it, it seems to me, is to pray the Lord's Prayer on a very regular basis, deliver us from evil. There's a reason that's there. And to go wisely and humbly into whatever battles we are called to fight, and not to go looking for battles that we aren't called to fight. It seems to me that there's a real danger of just sort of treating this as a fun playground. Is that enough? You got it?
That'll pass.
Well, how do you feel about it, Luke?
I feel that Rob Bell says I have vague answers, and N.T. Wright says I have bad questions. So.
But show us the smile again. Yeah.
One of the questions that I think has to be brought in at some point is it's pretty clear, if the Gospels are even generally reliable, that Jesus believed in the reality of demons. He spent a good portion of his ministry casting demons out, rebuking them. Even one time having a short conversation with Legion. And he clearly believed in Satan, and that was the central thing that he was about. And I've always had trouble calling him Lord and correcting his theology. He says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things that I do? I think it could also be posed as, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't believe the things that I teach?
But I think part of the trouble is that the word Satan, used as a proper name, that's why I talk about the saint Satan with a small s, because it seems to me there is something sub-personal about that entity, whatever it is. And the reason that I would be cautious is because if you say, sure, I believe in the existence of a being called Satan, that can be seen as playing straight into all kinds of caricature figures. So I just want to distance myself from that and say, we don't have good language for this. There is a reality out there, but let's just use cautious language rather than saying, bang, Jesus believed in Satan, so I'm going to as well. Actually, believed in Satan is the wrong phrase, but Michael Green wrote that book, I Believe in Satan's Downfall, which was in his I Believe series. He was going to call it I Believe in Satan, and then he realized that's a stupid thing to put on the book.
I believe in you, I have faith in Satan. Yeah,
exactly.
But you're not saying that. I mean, in the New Testament, they use Satan as a proper name.
Well, yes, but that's a kind of local convention which means what it means within that first century Jewish world. Our problem is that the word Satan has then had a long life in the Middle Ages, in witch trials, whatever.
Oh, sure.
And so, as I find myself compelled to do in some other things, I have to step back and say, precisely because I want to understand what these words meant in the first century, we have to be careful about saying things which people instantly will think, oh yes, I know what he's talking about. It's that stuff so-and-so said in the 80s.
I totally get the need to distance Satan from like the God Pan and all those kind of characters in the Middle Ages and whatever. So I'm really with you on that. But then the other side, what concerns me is that if we say, well, he's impersonal or go in that direction, you lose that whole thing where in the New Testament he's crafty, he's deceptive, he sets traps.
But that's why I said
intelligent,
subpersonal. There's a sort of, and I think C.S. Lewis gets at this quite well in one of his science fiction novels, where he has this unhuman, this character who has been human and isn't quite anymore. It's that sort of there's something missing, and it is crafty and it is mean and deceitful. Tough stuff.
How would you, if you were like zoning into, I'm teaching undergrad students, take the question of demon and then use it as a place to introduce fun, cool, nerdy words like hermeneutics and epistemology? Because I feel like if you use it around God, right? Oh, is God personal or impersonal? People get all hung up. But there's way more people in the church who could think about epistemologies, be they local first century Jewish ones or contemporary 21st century or whatever epistemologies, and hermeneutics, the science of interpretation. How could like demons, the demonic? This is one of the parts about Beck's book I really liked. Is it's sensitive about the epistemological and hermeneutical parts around that question, while engaging the scriptures. That helps us then. On the back end, he sneaks it around. He's like, hey, progressive Christian, you got to do more than this. And I'm like, oh my God, he just got me. So how would this conversation be when you introduce epistemology and hermeneutics?
It's tough. I mean, there's students and students. And in the present student world, quite a lot of students who will study in the kind of class that I might teach come from comparatively conservative homes. Equally, certainly in St. Andrews, quite a lot certainly don't, and come up as atheists. They want to read theology or religion because they just got interested in it. And so you're dealing with quite different areas. And for me, that's why I would stick with solid history as far as one can, and only get into that sort of question at a later stage. I mean, it depends what sort of course you're teaching, but that is a real problem. I would not myself start on this ground. I'd start with some quite other things, like why did Jesus teach in parables or something like that.
Yeah, like you said, first day of class on hermeneutics or theology. Let's talk about demons.
Well, you know what's funny is like if you grow up as a minister's kid and like the overeducated part, even in the South. My dad, Baptist church planter. You never believed in real demons or Satan or any of this junk because you believed in evolution. And everyone that believed in any of it thought role-playing games and J.R. Tolkien was evil and maybe C.S. Lewis. Like, that was your, like, experience. Carmen was your best hermeneutical guide to the demonic, and that involves Rocky for Jesus references and counting backwards after the knockout via boxing. And so I like one of the.
Why did you just start talking a foreign language here?
I know it's. We'll let Greg translate because he's in the United States. But there's this. I think there's this sense because of the anti-intellectualism of American evangelicalism that a lot of parts of Scripture just get bottled up in the. I think Daniel 7 plus Revelation and random parts of Thessalonians equal a chart that involves Russia, bears, and foreign policy.
Gog and Magog.
That then you just demythologize everything Boltman style, and you never even think about it until you have this encounter experience or 9/11 or something like this that shakes you, and you're like, WTF, human beings aren't the most rational, sane agents that under proper knowledge choose the good. But like all of that talk was attached to I was evil by rolling D20s and playing a dwarf who wanted to be faithful to his dead father and avenge Orc Snarg.
That's Hamlet, actually.
Oh, that's so good.
Well, it was Shakespeare's birthday just the other day, so
Shakespeare's birthday, your new grandkid, it's all.
Absolutely.
You know, that's always a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of what goes on here. People find a demon behind every headache and every hemorrhoid and every whatever. And it's like at some point you just outgrow that. And so then folks go to the other extreme and just want nothing to do with it because I tag it with. Yeah. I had an experience in 1987 with this young lady that I was counseling, and I can't get into all the details here, but 9 months counseled her in this rural church. I was an interim pastor, and I know some things were peculiar. Whenever I'd talk about Jesus, she would start to like twitch her head a little bit and grunt. And I I'm just right out of grad school, and so I believed in the reality of the demons at the time, but it didn't intersect with my real world at all. Mm-hmm. And so I thought she must have had some kind of abuse surrounding the name of Jesus or crucifix or whatever. So I'd back off. And so for 9 months it went like this, and she made a lot of progress in a lot of areas. But at the end of this 9-month internship that I was doing, or the pulpit filling, I really didn't know where she stood with Christ, since I was going to press this issue. And I don't know why I decided to do it in a Dairy Queen. But
why? Why not?
I thought she wouldn't.
Chocolate dip salt.
I thought she wouldn't act out. But I started talking to her about Christ and about.
Is that like breaking up with someone in public so they don't make a scene?
I don't know what I was thinking.
In public.
I don't know what I was thinking.
It won't be that bad.
Anyways,
if you have Dennis the Menace on the side of a Blizzard cup.
Anyways, it was the devil's food cake. So I started pressing it. She starts twitching her head and grunting, but I didn't back off. And I'm really just trying to tell her, I'm sharing the gospel with her. And then she just exploded in this Dairy Queen. She stood up and was scratching at the wall and spitting, and her head was twitching like this. And I apologized, but she was out of it. She was just doing this. The manager comes out. Well, there's a family there with these two little kids. And they're like, they bolted. They just like, boo.
Yeah, not your normal post T-ball game.
So then
experience.
Yeah, it's not what you're looking for. And then this manager, this young kid comes out, and he asked me, he goes, is there a problem? It's like, no.
Yeah, father of lies.
Anyways, the police came, and they took her back to this farm where she lived, because apparently, it's a small town, and everyone knows everyone, so they had made an agreement with the mother. She'd been institutionalized once before, and the mother didn't want her to go in again, because then she wouldn't get out till she's 18, blah, blah, blah. I had to go do a funeral, and so when I was done with this funeral, I got a note that said, go to this house, because there's an emergency, and it was this girl's house. I get there, and this girl had destroyed the house. The police had come and dropped her off, and the parents finally locked her in the back in this barbed wire fence area of this farm. And the mother wanted me to figure I'd made progress before, so I maybe could help this. So I go back there, and her arms are all bloody because she's been scraping them up against this barbed wire. And she's still doing this kind of grunty, head twitching thing. But then she'd get coherent again. And she'd go back and forth between these two states. And when she was coherent, she told me, don't try to cross that fence or I'll kill myself. And so I'm honoring that boundary. And at one point, maybe 15 minutes into this, I don't know, but she saw some barbed wire in the ground, and she was in one of these grunting stages, twitching her head. She grabbed this barbed wire and wrapped it around her neck, and then tried to saw her head off. So I had to jump over the fence and tackle her to the ground. And as I'm holding her there, I first of all noticed that she's very, very strong. Now, I am about 30 years old at this point. I was buff back then. She's a 15-year-old girl, and it was all I could do to keep her from being able to put that barbed wire back and forth. And I call for help, say, you got to call, ambulance, this is beyond me. As I'm holding her there, and there's probably 10 minutes before the ambulance gets there, at one point, she opens her eyes, and it gave me just this, she wasn't home. It was like there was a vacancy there. And it was only then, I had a PhD in theology. And it was only at that point that it occurred to me that there's a story about this in the Gospels. The level of ignorance astounds me. And the boy who was trying to throw himself in the fire, harm himself, here she is trying to cut her head off. And that when he came to the vicinity of Jesus, he would shriek. And every time I bring up Jesus, she would start to grunt and twitch and stuff. And that was the first thing that put a crack in my Western worldview, where I had a theoretical belief in this stuff, but it didn't really impact how I did my life, how I processed anything. And so then I went on this long research project trying to figure out, okay, what is this all about? And I went to conferences and read books, and I'd say 98% of it was just nonsense. It was more like the way pagans cast out demons, with all the chants and the formulas, and you got to get the names, and it doesn't look anything like the New Testament. In fact, the reason I wrote God at War was to finally say, okay, we need an academic, solid, respectful treatment of this, because otherwise I can see why people throw the whole thing out, because so much of it is flaco. But see, despite the flaco-ness, there's some stuff that's genuine, and It makes a difference in how you look at the world and how you live in the world.
And that was Scott Peck's point, wasn't it? That in some cases there really is something which goes beyond anything that psychologists can do. And the other medical problems which could start looking like that. One of my children is epileptic. Sure. She's medicated now, so she doesn't have seizures. But when you see somebody having a major seizure, those are the sorts of things that you think. And then you think, well, hang on, did they know about this in the ancient world? And actually, they were quite sophisticated. They knew the difference between quite a lot of different things in the ancient world. So it isn't just, they believed in demons then, but we now know it's all just ordinary illness, because really it isn't.
Richard, what would you say to that as a psychologist, and how would you respond to that story?
We know there's nothing like getting a closing thought to Greg Boyd and N.T. Wright, just telling him what's up.
Can you just bring a summation to all this?
Yeah, well, I think the thing that struck me in the story isn't, I don't think I can from this distance say one thing or the other. I think the thing that struck me, what you said, is the first crack in your Western view. And I think that's the thing that haunts me about this, is that coming back to liberals and progressives, if anything, they care about colonialism and they care about the third world, and yet they won't respect how, when you go to those contexts, it's a very enchanted worldview, and Christianity is thriving in the global South, and it has a very distinctive, charismatic character to it. And so maybe we are the ones that are a bit out of step here with what the Spirit's doing.
Yeah, and it isn't. Fundamentalists don't have a monopoly on closed-mindedness.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The thing that's interesting is that since the 80s, with the whole postmodern turn, increasing numbers of ethnographers have been accepting that the Western worldview is as much a social construct as any other worldview, and therefore it's illegitimate to try to translate the experiences of people in other cultures into your categories, so they go native. And one result of that has been, there's been increasing numbers of reports of people experiencing what we would call supernatural, including possessions and deliverances and healings and things like that. Edith Turner wrote first an article called "The Spirits Are Real." She's an anthropologist and an ethnographer. The Spirits Are Real, and then a following book on what was called "Experiencing a Ritual," and she recounts there some of the things she was an eyewitness towards. Levitation, just weird stuff. But her whole point is, this stuff is real, and it's just the Western worldview that has been refusing to look at that. Yeah. I think things like that help confirm the reality of this stuff.
Yeah. I think if I were to describe this scene here to my wife when I get back home, she would regard it with as much disbelief as most people would regard levitation.
There you go. Here.
So why don't you all give Tom and Richard a hand as they get up, and Tony joins Luke and I for a little battle of Au Contraire, Mon Frere.
Oh, I'm not done yet?
Theological game experience.
No fair. They get to be done and I'm not. I am close to brain dead. Of course, that puts me and Tony on the same par, I guess. So